Welcome to Promoting Attendance Early, Absenteeism in Kindergarten and the Early Grades. Today is April 24th, 2024, and to start this series-long discussion, we wanted to talk about why we targeted our TA on kindergarten and how we feel that the early grades have emerged as a pivotal and actionable area in the chronic absenteeism conversation. My name is Tanika Reed, and along with my colleague Tori Martin, the two of us have coordinated this session for the Student Engagement and Attendance Center. Before we get started, we wanted to do some introductions. We'd like to thank the department staff, including Dr. Tracy Scott, Brian Cohane, and Liz Lembo, who give us the resources to make this series possible, as well as the joint leadership of Dr. Charles Crocker and Sarah Frizzell of the Student Engagement and Attendance Center, who helped lead this entire operation. Today, we're joined by two extra special presenters, one of which is Swati Adhikar, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy and Learning and the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, who will help frame today's discussion in the larger context of the Department of Education priorities, and Hedy Cheng, the Executive Director of Attendance Works, who will begin our conversation on the data behind the early grade absenteeism conversation later on in today's session. So let's talk about why we're doing this. Overall, we created this series in response to LEAs, schools, and chronic absenteeism partners highlighting this area as an opportunity for priority and for action. And we really see the SEAC role as amplifying this to our audiences, creating a forum for all of you guys to share with your peer about your reflections, and offering actionable next steps that you can take before the next school year starts in August. This series, while focusing on kindergarten, also acknowledges the pre-K through third grade context. And the goal of this series is to explore chronic absenteeism and support attendance for early grade students, kindergarten in particular, understanding the various needs of different specific higher needs student populations. We're going to do this throughout 3 sessions. In session 1 today, we'll talk about the current landscape of the chronic of absenteeism in kindergarten, exploring the impacts and the data of the chronic absenteeism in conversation in kindergarten. In session 2, next week, we'll start using tools like root cause analysis to identify the factors behind kindergarten chronic absence and amplify equitable considerations for special populations of kindergarten learners. And in 2 weeks, in session 3, we'll begin to start talking about different perspectives, for approaching kindergarten chronic absenteeism and different strategies that you guys can take in order to enact this in your own schools. So, okay, this is session 1. And it's really about framing the conversation, talking about why kindergarten is important, and putting us in the general context of understanding so that we're all on a level playing field for this conversation. Today, we're going to start out with the remarks by the Department of Education, then move on to an audience-specific discussion of chronic absence, begin examining some of the data and the evidence behind chronic absence with Hedy, and finally engage in a breakout room activity where you can explore this data yourself and talk about this issue and chronic absenteeism in your school, your SEA, your LEA, and your district. All right, so without further ado, I'm now pleased to introduce Swati Adhikar, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy and Early Learning and the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education in the Department of Education, who will spend a few minutes highlighting the department priorities in this area. So Swati, welcome. Thank you so
Thank
much for
you.
joining us today.
Tanika, thank you so much for that warm welcome. I'm delighted to be with all of you today, and I thank all of you who are joining and making time at a very busy time in the school year to focus on an issue of consequence and urgency, supporting everyday attendance for our young elementary school students, and specifically kindergartners. I join my colleagues at the Student Engagement and Attendance Center in offering kudos to the work that Hedy Cheng and her team at Attendance Works and others have done to shine the spotlight on this issue and its connection to improving student achievement for our most vulnerable and underserved students. We're all here today because we care about moving the dial on kindergarten and early grade chronic absence, and know if we get serious about the collaboration it takes, we can create new norms and improve school climates and culture that get kids back to school and staying in school. We have an opportunity to explore the roles we can each play and the strategies that must cross and connect state educational agencies, districts, and community partners to truly transform the upcoming school year and the school years after that. I want to now share why the department is focused on early learning, and specifically kindergarten, to support early school success for every student, especially students who are low income, English learners, or who have a disability. The department has embraced a bold early learning agenda across the preschool through third grade continuum. We're working closely with our partners at Health and Human Services on those foundational years before kindergarten. Our Raise the Bar agenda to advance early school success has two tracks. The first, to expand access to high quality preschool, encouraging the use of Title I funds. And second, to ensure kindergarten is a sturdy bridge between the early years and early grades. You may be wondering, why are we focusing on kindergarten? Because kindergarten is our first opportunity at scale to reach every young student who comes to kindergarten and provide those critical supports and interventions that can assure on-track development. Because kindergarten is a key inflection point for which students will experience early school success and which will not. Because kindergarten is an important opportunity to partner with parents and families to build the relationships, routines, and habits that are essential to early school success and to everyday school attendance at this time when kindergarten chronic absence rates are extraordinarily high, and I know you're going to be discussing that today. Let's take a look at an example of the data that supports this two-track approach. Take a look at the bottom left and look at that green circle. Notice the 6-point literacy gap for low-income kids at kindergarten entry. High-quality preschool can help close that gap, and we work closely with Health and Human Services on this strategy. Now take a look at the red rectangle and notice that for low-income kids, that literacy gap widens from 6 to 11 points during the kindergarten year. And notice again, that cumulative gap of 11 points persists into and through the elementary grades, making third grade proficiency in reading beyond the reach for far too many children. Chronic absence in kindergarten and the early grades, as you will hear today, has a direct connection to third grade outcomes, particularly for our low-income students. Moreover, we know that online learning is not a solution for our young learners who build their knowledge, their executive function skills, and social emotional development in the context of relationships. Kindergarten students do not come to school on their own. We can significantly improve kindergarten attendance by incorporating 3 strategies as essential components of an effective back-to-school plan. First, catch up on missed early childhood vaccinations. Many states have lower vaccination rates for measles, mumps, and rubella, and polio, and other important regular early childhood vaccines that unfortunately took a backseat during COVID. Currently, only 13 states across the country have herd immunity for measles, mumps, and rubella, leaving 250,000 kindergartners across the country at risk each year. This will lead to the spread of infectious disease that is preventable and likely even worse rates of chronic absence. Children need their up-to-date vaccinations for their kindergarten registration and enrollment. Outreach efforts beginning now are critical for public health and everyday attendance in the coming school year. Second, support kindergarten enrollment efforts that begin early and provide clear communication and outreach in multiple languages, and build relationships with community organizations, families, and most of all, parents, so they know when, where, and how to sign their child up for kindergarten. We should do everything we can to ensure that families begin the school year with a positive, welcoming, and affirming experience from the outset. Let's create ready schools. We know that kindergarten isn't mandatory in all states, nor necessarily full day, but we need to help parents and families know why kindergarten is a pivotal and foundational educational year for their children's learning and development, and how it's important to future progress in elementary school and beyond, as the data slide showed. We've got to do more to help parents better understand what they can do to support their children's academic progress, beginning with everyday school attendance in kindergarten. Third, ensure robust and seamless kindergarten transition. Let's make sure kindergarten transition efforts reach the most underserved children and go beyond simply a light touch approach to create a sturdy bridge between the early years and the early grades. There's ample research on kindergarten transition best practices with available tools and strategies to support effective kindergarten transition efforts that meaningfully engage parents, families, and community organizations. Let's remember also to reach out and connect early educators with early elementary teachers and leaders, and include summer programming in our transition efforts for continuous learning and other supports, such as summer meals and health outreach to support healthy development. We're eager to work with you to seize this window from now to back to school. The back to school strategies and the department's kindergarten sturdy bridge pre-K third agenda are guided by the enabling conditions for success. These include an equity lens to focus on the most underserved children, professional learning that connects early educators and elementary teachers, authentic partnerships with parents and families, and that important interagency, cross-sector, and community-wide collaboration where it can all come together. These are all essential to improving everyday school attendance, and we've incorporated these enabling conditions to harness the levers of the department to support your state and local improvement efforts through technical assistance opportunities like this series, the recently released Title I preschool guidance, and a series of grants. We're so excited that everyday school attendance in kindergarten and the early grades will also be supported through a new Center for Early School Success that will be announced shortly as part of the department's national comprehensive and regional centers. Additionally, here's a list of recent resources to support your work. We know that together we can transform the coming school year for our incoming kindergartners by giving them a smooth on-ramp to early school success. Let's commit to demonstrating why and how showing up to school every day in kindergarten counts. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Deputy Assistant Secretary Swati Adhikar, for that introduction, for framing this in the larger context of the Department of Education's priorities, and for setting the stage for our discussion today. We really appreciate you giving that context of the federal level of what's going on here. So now I'd like to take a moment to talk about how this is relevant to states, schools, and districts, the people who I believe to be on this call today. We've really crafted this learning series in response to our audience repeatedly flagging early grade absenteeism as an issue. A recurring theme that the SEAC has heard from both LEAs and our TA and attendance partners working in this space is a lack of explicit discussion about early learners and how states, working with both their schools and their districts, can take an active role in addressing an early grade absenteeism. Swati's already discussed this a little bit already, but as we know, children enter kindergarten from a diverse array of early learning settings and experiences, and with a wide range of developmental strengths, learning differences, and different needs. Kindergarten is often the introduction to school life for a lot of these students, and it develops a path for children to become students. These students then learn the fundamentals that set them up for success throughout their school career. Helping our youngest learners and their families overcome barriers to getting to school and establish a routine of daily attendance is what we feel to be essential to helping these early learners reach this kind of success. In addition to that, a kindergarten is really an opportunity for educators. Kindergarten often marks the first step where schools can begin to connect with parents and families in a standardized K through 12 kind of setting. For previous attendees of SEAC events, SEAC's previous learning series on Tier 1 interventions really began to demonstrate how school-wide engagement with parents and families directly influences both test scores and educational outcomes. This is true across the board for all students, but it's also very true for kindergarten as well. Not only can educators build relationships with students, but kindergarten and the early grades overall is the first step where they can also begin to build strong relationships with their parents and their families. As a routine is developed around sharing a child's learning experience every single weekday, you begin to build a relationship that emphasizes working together to a child's success and is an area where school-wide interventions, parent and family engagement, and really just keeping students in the classroom all intersect in order to create a student's success. Building these relationships with families can also help begin to uncover root causes and really the reasons why students aren't attending school as much, which is a topic that we really want to focus in more on in our session 2, which is happening on next Wednesday. But to begin to localize this conversation for you guys, let's talk about how the SEA, the LEA, the state, and the school role really comes into this conversation. Kindergarten is unique in its positioning between both preschool and pre-K and the traditional K through 12 system. There are a lot of overlapping responsibilities and siloed structures that make it challenging for individual schools to change the trend of kindergarten chronic absence. So schools and districts have an opportunity to make an efficient impact in a space where local schools have been highlighting this as a need. States stand at the unique position where they can identify, quantify, and amplify this issue, while encouraging local schools and districts to take specific steps that have an evidence basis for promoting equity across promoting educational equity across the school system. So the way that this is currently understood is that states report to the Department of Education via EdFacts annually on chronic absenteeism for all public schools and LEAs in the state for students in the K through 12 system. And in addition to that, states have discretion to use chronic absenteeism as an ESEA indicator, and many of you guys have chosen to do so. However, across the chronic absenteeism field, there's a lot of disagreement about how much of this information is actually publicly available, how much of it is disaggregated across specific student populations, and how much of this that you can actually take action on and is available for you to use as a resource in order to promote your own strategies in relation to kindergarten and early grade absenteeism. We've seen a lot of local strategies emerge for addressing chronic absenteeism in the younger grades and including in kindergarten. And you'll begin to hear about some of those strategies in session 3 when we have our panel discussion. But session 1 focuses really articulates why this population is so important and both the data, the present data, and the missing data that underlies this issue. As we noted, attendance in kindergarten is an indicator for attendance patterns and academic success in the later grades. However, as we'll see in Hetty's discussion, kindergarten chronic absence levels remain higher in other grades and remain higher in comparison to other grades than many states. Typically, even when the SEAC does these kind of activities, our discussions on chronic absence tend to focus on the later grade, the 11th grade, the 12th grades, and our older learners. This misses a crucial opportunity for states to address chronic absenteeism early. Okay, so we've done a lot of forecasting about the data discussion that we're about to jump into. But right before we do that, we also want to contextualize this on how it looks for you as an SEA or an LEA or a school system affiliate. The chronic absenteeism conversation across the board is really nuanced, and this is really clear in kindergarten as well. As we begin to discuss the data that drives this issue, we wanted to take a moment to highlight the different factors that may influence your participation in this conversation and how this data may look different for you in your state. While there are many patterns that emerge across different data sets, we also need to consider the various factors that affect attendance in different communities and how different communities have different reasons for chronic absence. So on the slide that you can see here before you, you can see some of those questions that may impact your approach to kindergarten chronic absence, like whether or not kindergarten is even compulsory in your state, whether or not you guys engage in full day or half day kindergarten, and the transportation concerns aligned with that. Whether or not your chronic absenteeism is shaped by parents or it's something that's kind of seasonally dependent. We encourage you to consider these and other community-specific discussion questions as we move our discussion along to Hedy Chang, the Executive Director of Attendance Works. Hetty Chang, today also joined by Anika Williams, is the founder and executive director of Attendance Works, a national state-level initiative aimed at advancing student success by addressing chronic absence. Hetty, thank you so much for joining us and for your time today. We really appreciate it. Could you help us understand what this issue looking like on the data level and what data there is involved in kindergarten chronic absence?
Great. Thanks so much, Taniko. Thank you so much, Assistant Secretary Adarkar, for all your leadership on this. It is such a pleasure to be here. Let's go to the next slide. I want to start by just explaining to people that one of the reasons that we didn't know that chronic absence was a challenge for kindergartners is we, for years, never looked at it. When I first started this work in 2006 to look at whether or not chronic absence was a challenge, people only looked at average daily attendance or truancy. Truancy is unexcused absences, tends to look at individual compliance with school rules. And because younger kids tend to not miss school without the permission of a parent, parents tend to know kids are missing school. We were thinking that their truancy was mostly an older kid issue, not a younger kid issue. And average daily attendance, which in some states is used for funding, tends to notice aggregate data, but it actually, again, you can have like a 90% or a 95% average daily attendance and can still have high levels of chronic absence, including starting in kindergarten. So that's why it's so important that we start to look at this issue of chronic absence, which has only been started to used as a metric for maybe the last 5 years. And this is also about understanding that this is about taking prevention, problem solving, not punitive approaches, because when kids are chronically absent, the key is to engaging families to figure out what's going on and how you can improve it. If you go to the next slide, this is just a little bit more I think Swati and others have already talked about, we know that attendance every day matters to the youngest learners. If kids are chronically absent in pre-K and K, they're more likely to be absent in later grades, less likely to count and read proficiently. Especially this is challenging for lower income kids who might not have the same resources at home to make up for the task, what they lost, learning opportunities in the classroom. And it's actually associated not just with academic declines, but declines in educational engagement, social emotional development, and executive functioning. So what we don't invest in early, we pay for later. And we also know that when kids are having this regular routine of attendance, and I think we saw this so much during the pandemic, it is so beneficial because it helps the kids become less anxious, connect to peers, and as well as feel connected to the adults in the schools so they can learn. Next slide. And we have research that shows that it's not that chronic absence both affects performance in the later grades if it's chronic absence in kindergarten, but also that one of the risks that places kids at greater risk for chronic absence is not having been in preschool the year before. And I think this is one of the reasons that's contributing to chronic absence during the pandemic or post-pandemic, because so many kids end up not being in some kind of formal care setting during the pandemic. And we're still getting back more kids into those formal care settings, which is a key to establishing the routines and establishing the connections to learning that help kids show up then regularly in kindergarten. Next slide. And we also know from pre-pandemic research that if you have this pattern of chronic absence that occurs every year and it isn't interrupted, it places serious risks for kids for reading. So if you look at this slide, the green bar at the far left are the kids who were never chronically absent in pre-K through second. The bar on the far right showing at risk needs substantial intervention based on Dibble scores are the kids who were chronically absent pre-K first and second. Next slide. And what we're seeing across the country is that chronic absence has nearly doubled, at least based on the last time we have national data, which is 21-22, affecting nearly 1 out of 3 kids. And the data from states for 22-23 indicate that rates remain still pretty high, only probably having declined about 2%. And if you go to the next slide, one of the challenges with this is it's not just nearly 1 out of 3 kids who are chronically absent. It's the 2 out of 3 kids, or 66% of kids, who are now in a school with 20% or more levels of chronic absenteeism. When you have 20% or more of the kids in a school who are chronically absent, the impact is not just on the kids who are chronically absent. It's also on their peers, because it is harder for teachers to teach, teachers to set classroom norms, and for kids to learn when you have that kind of churn going on in the classroom. And if you go to the next slide, you can see that we've seen an enormous increase in the number of schools experiencing high chronic absence levels. And it, as well as even extreme chronic absence levels, meaning 30% or more chronic absenteeism. And where that increase has occurred the most has been among elementary schools in terms of sheer numbers, because we have more elementary schools in the country. So we went from less than 4,000 schools with 30% or more levels of chronic absence to nearly 20,000. And in these schools, it means that you're going to have to take a much more systemic approach to improving attendance. And if you go to the next slide, you can see that taking this more systemic approach is going to have to start in kindergarten, where we see some of the highest levels of chronic absence. This is chronic absence levels by grade. You can see it. It's kind of like a U-shaped curve, or we sometimes call it the Nike swoosh. Starts high in kindergarten, and then it goes high on the later grades. Addressing what happens in kindergarten is crucial to improving attendance and engagement for all kids. And if you go to the next slide, and as you think about your own data, I want you to look at 2 kinds of issues. This is data from the California Department of Education. And it gives you an illustration of what you can understand. So when you look at the far right column, you're seeing the chronic absence rates for any particular group. And you do see some really extraordinarily high levels of chronic absence for African American kids, Native American kids, Hispanic or Latino kids, and Pacific Islanders. And it is important to understand which kids are disproportionately affected, because those populations may be facing particular challenges that you're going to need to understand and address. But it's also important to look at overall numbers if you want to get a handle on how do we tailor strategies to make sure that we get sort of the most bang for the buck. So if you look at this, you'll also see that of the 187,000 or nearly 188,000 kindergartners who were chronically absent in California last year, 120,000 of them were Latino or Hispanic. And that means we're going to have to understand their realities to address how do we really get kids showing back up to school. So both types of situations are important to address, but it's really important to look at numbers. And you still can see that there's a substantial number, maybe 26, almost 27,000 kids who are white kids who are also chronically absent. So this isn't an issue that only affects kids of color. It affects all our kids, but knowing who and how many is really important to strategies. And if you go to the next slide, you can also see that you can look at this also by other kinds of subgroups. So English language learners are a large portion. Kids who are living in poverty are a large portion of the kids who are chronically absent. Kids with disabilities are a large portion of the kids who are chronically absent. And this gives you some handles on how you might have to think about outreach and tailoring your strategies to the kids who are chronically absent so you can most effectively improve their attendance. And if you go to the next slide, you can see that what we really need to do is make sure that we understand what causes kids to miss too much school. And usually there are multiple causes. But for every group, we want to know, is it barriers? Is it aversion? Is it disengagement? Is it misconceptions? And understanding what these issues are can help us develop the right kinds of solutions to get them to school. And if you go to the next slide, I will say that what we see in here is that these high levels that we still have right now reflect the fact that we are still struggling to put back in place positive conditions for learning, making sure that kids feel physically, emotionally healthy and safe. They and their families. For kindergartners, this is certainly a family affair. Making sure there's a sense of belonging, connection, support. Making sure that families understand what are kids learning every single day. Especially sometimes families aren't even allowed on school campuses because of safety and security issues. So how do we communicate with families? Because if they don't know what kids are learning and know the value of that learning, they might not understand how crucial it is for their kids to show up every day. And it's about investing in the adult and student well-being so that the relationships that we know that are so essential to this can be put in place. And if you go to the next slide, this is really about looking about how do we create a more systemic approach to this with the levels so high. This is not about what one person does. This is about how we as a system put in place those foundational supports, tier 1 universal prevention, and then use our data to see who needs more, early intervention or intensive intervention.
That was awesome. Thank you so much, Hetty, for sharing that. That was wonderful, a great overview of the data behind kindergarten and early grade chronic absence and why it is so important to prioritize attendance early. We are now going to take, and we're right on schedule, so we'll take about 20 minutes to move into our breakout rooms. If you go to the next slide. We're going to take some time to reflect on the data and all of the conversations that we've heard so far today and connect across state teams. In a moment, you'll be pulled into random breakout rooms for discussions in smaller group settings. We encourage you for this portion to turn on your cameras and your microphones. It's an open discussion. We would love to hear all of your voices. The SEAC team has prepared data profiles of kindergarten chronic absenteeism trends in 6 states. During the 20 minutes in your breakout rooms, you will be with a SEAC facilitator who will guide the groups in looking at 2 state data profiles, time allowing. Participants will explore the selected data sets and reflect on trends with some guiding questions listed here on the screen. We will have a Padlet to take notes, so facilitators in each room will help note take, guide the discussion, but participants, we also encourage you to join in and add to the Padlet. Participants will also have access to the folder containing all 6 data profiles, so feel free to explore, even if you don't get a chance to look at them or you're curious, just poke around, you will have access to all 6 state data profiles. And then we will come back and hopefully have a few minutes to conclude and share some key takeaways. So I will open up the breakout rooms now. You should be automatically assigned, but if not, I will be in the main room and I can move some people around if need be, but I will go ahead and open up the rooms now. All right, I think everyone is joining back from their breakout rooms. We have about 5 minutes left. We have a few little wrap-up things to end, but I will ask for just one volunteer if we have anyone who wants to share, like particularly a key takeaway or something interesting you discussed in your breakout room. You can just come off mute if anyone feels like sharing.
Well, I was impressed by how just a simple thing as a relationship with the family can make such a huge difference in the lives of the students.
Yeah, definitely.
I was glad to know that we're not the only ones facing some of the challenges that we're facing. However, the efforts that are being made by the persons that were in our group were beneficial, gave us some things to ponder.
Thank you both so much for sharing. I wish we had more time to hear what everyone's conversations were like, but I'm sure everyone discussed different things, but hopefully all relevant and great discussion. Since we just have a few minutes left, I'll pass it back to my colleague, Taniko, who will wrap us up and close us out for today.
Yeah, Thank you so much, Tori. Shout out to Group 3, the group that I was in. We had a really great discussion about some of the root causes and some of the factors that kind of shape this experience. So this was only a very short session. We've only been together for an hour, but this conversation is not yet over. Next Wednesday at the exact same time, from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll begin to continue this conversation by having a discussion about engaging in root cause analysis to identify the factors behind kindergarten chronic absence, and also really situate this in an equity lens as we amplify special considerations for special populations of kindergarten learners. And please do not forget to join us for our third session of this series, when we'll hear from a panel of federal, state, and local stakeholders to hear about strategies and actionable steps and things you can do now in order to prepare for the next school year that's starting in August. So again, thank you all so much for joining us today. And we would also like to make a request of you guys. Could you help us understand your needs? If you could, there's a feedback form link that just got dropped in the chat. And there's also a QR code on your screen right here. Please fill this out, help us help you, and make these sessions better. We really want to help you guys turn the curve on this issue. So helping out and filling out this feedback form will really go a long way in doing that. I got a couple of requests for people to have more resources and also the slides for this session, and a follow-up email will come out in the next couple of days, including all of that information. And if you want to go deeper on this and get some one-on-one expertise with our subject matter experts, please don't hesitate to let us know. Reach out to SEA Center at westat.com in order to get in contact with the SEAC, and we are more than happy to either connect you with ourselves or a chronic absenteeism partner who can help your state or your district make some really big changes on this issue. So yeah, thank you again so much for joining us. We hope that you have a wonderful rest of your morning or afternoon or evening. And thank you so much for being a part of this session. Have a great rest of your day.